Welcome to In Conversation with Global Challenges. And we've got a great lineup of speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. My name is Sharon Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Challenges program here at the University of Wollongong, and this is our interdisciplinary research program. And we're very glad to be talking to everyone today. Thank you all for coming and listening. And I'm going to go straight to Dr. Anthony McKnight to give us a welcome to country. Over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Sharon. Firstly, I'd just like to say I respect country, the country that I'm on, and the countries that everyone else who's viewing this today, to share my respects to those countries, and to get everyone just to think about something that they're thankful for this day, whether it was the cool morning where you could kind of snuggle up and not be too hot, or the birds that woke you up, or that you heard when you were waking up, and the one that's just singing here now in the background of me. Thank you for the sun that's now giving me warmth. All these ancestors, all these ancients that do so much for us each day that we need to be thankful for. So I'd just like everyone just to have a few seconds of just thinking of something that from country that they're thankful for. Could have been the seafood they ate last night that is now giving them energy and minerals and a sense of being satisfied. So just let people have that little bit of time to give thanks. And I'll just ask all those ancients and ancestors that you just thanked, that they be part of that we have them in mind with us when we're listening to each other and where the people are talking, that we consider all these entities that provide us so much on this day. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anthony. And I'm really thankful for the beautiful fig trees that we've got outside on the campus at the University of Wollongong and the wind that's blowing through them. So I'd like to introduce our five panelists for today. And we've got a range of panelists from across the region. So people are joining in from all over the South Coast. But as you just heard, that welcome to country was by Dr. Anthony McKnight. And he researches Aboriginal English terms and country and how that's central in research and implementing holistic Aboriginal approaches to education. He leads one of our Global Challenges projects, which is called Stories Affording Pathways to Healing. And that's enabling communities to share stories and how these stories can serve as ways of recovering and building resilience. So welcome, Anthony. We also have Samatha Avitaia who's the campus manager at the University of Wollongong's regional campus at Bega. And Sam was instrumental in allowing that campus and enabling that campus to be used as an evacuation shelter during last summer's bushfires. And so we're really grateful to Sam for that amazing work that they did over the summer. And it's great to have participants and colleagues from our regional campuses joining us today. So welcome, Sam. We also have Dr. Joshua Whittaker, and Josh is also a lead on one of our projects that was funded this year. He's interviewed hundreds of people affected by bushfires, including the 2009 Black Saturdays bushfires in Victoria, and the 2018 Reedy Swamp Tathra fires, and more recently the 2019-2020 New South Wales bushfires. And so far, his research teams have conducted 160 interviews with peoples affected by the 1920 bushfires in a major research project with New South Wales Rural Fire Service. So welcome, Josh. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Lorna Moxham, who's a professor of mental health nursing at the University of Wollongong. And Lorna is the lead of our Living Well Longer Challenge. And she's been a nurse for 40 years, 38 of those years specialising in mental health nursing. And she works on a number of boards looking at mental health, and is co-founder of Recovery Camp, which is one of the programs which has won awards for the way in which it intervenes in psychosocial educational programs and giving nursing students the opportunity to work with teams and as part of their training, but also Lorna's has that as a research project. So Global Challenges is the University of Wollongong's interdisciplinary research program, and we bring together researchers, community, government and industry to try to solve some of the world's most pressing problems, but we're also really conscious of the way in which our research is important to our local communities. And this year in particular, because of the bushfires and then COVID, but especially because of the bushfires, we devoted most of our research funding towards supporting projects that would help to rebuild the South Coast and help to ensure that we do a better job in future in terms of both our resilience to climate disasters, but also hopefully progressing action on climate change. So that's where we come into this from Global Challenges perspective. And just to start off with, I'd like to say that as a climate scientist of more than 20 years researching climate, but mainly climate change in Antarctica, I always knew that Australia was vulnerable to climate change and bushfires. But even though I knew that this was going to happen in my head, I was really shocked by last summer. And I think that's true for a number of climate scientists, that we knew that this could happen, but we were still really shocked by how it eventuated last summer. And so I was shocked by that devastation, but after this summer, I hoped that that would mean surely we would then start to take action on climate change. So it seemed like it was inevitable that that would be the consequence of that terrible summer that we experienced. And I want to make sure that that is the case, that we do take action on that, so that this is not something that in 20 years or 10 years time we look back on and go, we had that terrible summer of 2020 and we still didn't actually take the action that was needed. Then along came COVID, and it was like the whole world pivoted and once again showed that when people really want to work together and change and do things for the greater good, we can do it. But we've done that for COVID, and we've worked amazingly hard to make sure that most people in Australia are safe, and to try and to look after each other and to have that sense of community. But we still are not doing that. We're not working fast enough in the area of climate change. And so we need to both, from my perspective, I would say we need to both build resilience for for immediate disasters that we're going to have, like last summer, because they are going to happen. Even if we go to zero emissions now, we're still going to have bad summers in the future. We're going to have bad bushfires. We're going to have extreme heat events. We're still going to have droughts. But if we don't do something about climate change alongside that, we're going to be on this ever increasing escalator where those extreme events just get more extreme and more damaging, and ultimately will be just too difficult to deal with. So we have to do both of those things. And I think that's where I hope that this conversation, which is around, what do we need to do about climate change? What do we need to do about building resilience in our communities? And also, what do we need to do to look after each other so that we maintain our mental health through that? So that's what we're going to try and do. And we have a number of speakers for you who are going to give their perspective on that. And I'm going to first of all ask Lorna to talk to us a little bit about climate anxiety. And I've probably expressed a little bit of that now, because I did feel very anxious during last summer. But how do we deal with that climate anxiety, and how do we turn that into action-based and positive responses? So over to you, Lorna.
Thanks, Sharon. The first thing I want to do is help us to understand, and I suspect that most people on this our conversation with feel this way, but climate anxiety is actually a real phenomenon. So if you're not familiar, climate anxiety, it's also known as eco-anxiety. It's actually described by the American Psychological Society as a chronic fear of environmental doom. So it's that projection, it's that worry, that anxiety for our children, for our grandchildren, for our great-grandchildren about what's going to happen going forward, and not too far forward, reasonably closely, as Sharon's talked about. So climate anxiety is a fairly recent psychological disorder, but it's actually affecting an increasing number of individuals who worry about environmental crisis. So it's important to talk about eco-anxiety isn't pathological. It's actually a legitimate reaction to climate crisis. So eco-anxiety, despite the distress that some people may experience, is actually a demonstration of empathy. What it does, it's signalling a deep caring about our planet and a deep caring about our future. And if we think about Greta Thunberg, she, whether you agree with her or not, she deeply, deeply cares and demonstrates this when she talks about our planet's future. And that's not to say that people who don't have feelings of anxiety don't care, they do. It's just that for some people, the depth of caring manifests itself as anxiety. So as I've said, eco-anxiety is a reasonably new in my field. But for millennium, people have lived with and experienced anxiety. People can be anxious about all sorts of things. And it stands to reason that issues people are anxious about will change and will be informed or will drive or will be determined by what's happening around them. And Sharon alluded to it, COVID-19 is a perfect example. No one was anxious about COVID-19 in 2015, for example, but this year's global pandemic has raised people's anxiety levels, and we're seeing massive increase in people presenting to emergency departments, mental health nurses, psychologists, for example, with anxiety brought about or exacerbated COVID-19. So climate anxiety is real. It's something we need to talk about, and it's going to get worse as the climate declines. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Lorna. And I forgot to say at the beginning, this is supposed to be a conversation. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A and we'll try to answer them as we go, but we'll also have a session at the end where we'll answer some of those questions live on the seminar. So I'm now going to ask Sam to talk to us a little bit about the experience at Bega during the last summer's bushfires and what how did the campus get involved in that, and telling us about it from your own personal experience, because as we all know, many of you will have been intimately affected with the bushfires last summer, and Sam was one of you in that regard.
Thanks, Sharon. Talking about climate anxiety, I think I'm having Zoom anxiety at the moment, so excuse me if my voice wavers a little. Usually I'm just talking to my colleagues, but I can sense there's other people out there listening. You know, in terms of the bushfires, I've been a country girl pretty much all of my life. I grew up in this area and my family are farmers, and I returned to the area after university. So bushfires and the threat of bushfires is something I've lived with probably for a long time and been aware of. Certainly had the impending sense of doom coming through last year as a local person, watching the land dry out incredibly and feeling that bushfires were coming. But like you, Sharon, I actually couldn't grasp the enormity of what was about to happen. I certainly didn't expect to be in the middle of an enormous firestorm that felt like the end of the world. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever been through in my life, and I never want to go through it again. And my experience was probably mild compared to many other people in my community and friends and family who lost family members. They lost loved ones, they lost homes, they lost animals, they lost their businesses, their livelihoods. People lost everything. And it still makes me very emotional to talk about it, as you can probably hear. And that's a big part of being our community, is we're kind of getting used to everyone being emotional all the time. It's become part of our new normal that we have tears in our eyes when we talk about things, because it was just such a horrific experience. The fear was the big thing, the fear of not being in control. For me and for all the people who came to our campus and evacuated to our campus, all had that in common. Unlike COVID, which I feel quite in control in comparison, I can choose whether I leave my home, I can choose who I associate with, I can choose to wash my hands, I can choose to hide, I can choose so many things. But with the bushfires, I had absolutely no choices. I felt responsible for my children and my parents and my community and my family. And I couldn't control that. And that was, I think, for me, the most terrifying thing about it. And now when I see smoke or smell smoke or see orange skies or any of those things, I couldn't watch the ABC's weather phenomenon program last night. It's just still too raw. And those things trigger fear and anxiety, and it's certainly not anything uncommon. And as I said, people have been through a lot worse than me, and everyone has different experiences. I will say that I found that people who had been through any type of trauma in the past, whether that was fires or grief or loss or accidents or anything, found the fires more difficult to cope with, because it was like trauma upon trauma. And I can feel that myself, that if I have to go through something similar again, that trauma will be harder. And because I've been through this one, and because our community have been through this, we're sort of trying to shelter each other from other traumas. In terms of action and moving forward, you know, it has felt for the community and many of the community that COVID has overtaken what happened, and we felt very, very supported by the wider community and the world at the time that the fires happened. And, you know, when we had no power and the army was turning up with generators and all sorts of things were happening, and then there was outpouring of love and donations, and felt like we were on a really good trajectory, and the government as well, to listen and move forward. But I think you're right, COVID has in many ways taken the eye off that. But sitting here in the Bega Valley, it looks beautiful and green at the moment, but you only have to go off the road a little way and find areas that have no regrowth, there's no trees, there's no animals, and see that devastation and know that we need to do something about that. So that's a big feeling of anger in a lot of people, I think. On the positive side, it's also been very community building and very rewarding to be a part of a small community where everyone supports each other. And it's been very rewarding to be a part of the Global Challenges research projects as well, because it feels like we're putting all of these amazing brains and research and energy into something positive and helping find some, not solutions, but supportive strategies or research that will help us to make changes into the future. So that's been really great. For my colleagues and friends and family in the Bega Valley, anytime now that the bushfires is actually mentioned in news or research, that is really great to hear. It means that people haven't forgotten. So yeah, that's probably my story for now.
Thank you, Sam. And we haven't forgotten you. And that was a really nice segue into the work that Josh has been doing, because perhaps now Josh can talk to us a little bit about some of his research and experiences around interviewing people who've lived through the experience of bushfires all across Eastern Australia, and also perhaps tell us a little bit about the research that you're doing at the moment. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Sharon, and thank you, Sam. Yeah, look, I've been involved in a number of studies where our aim has been simply to listen to people's stories and experiences of bushfires. So, you know, probably beginning with Black Saturday and, you know, those tragic fires that killed 173 people and destroyed, you know, over 2,000 houses, through to some smaller fires that have affected a handful of houses and maybe a few farms. And I guess in terms of how people experience those events, I think it's important to remember that we often think about Black Saturday and the Black Summer that we've just had. They are very significant events, but people experience the same sorts of loss and grief and trauma from much smaller events too. So I'm always thinking about, you know, for example, people who went through the Reedy Swamp fire in 2018 in the Reedy Swamp and Tathra areas, who were threatened again last summer, and some of the people that we've been able to interview in our most recent research were actually people we spoke to in the Reedy Swamp and Tathra areas, and they're still recovering and trying to rebuild and going through a lot of challenges. So yeah, I'd really emphasise that it's not just the big events that we should be looking at and concerned about, but the smaller ones too. But I guess my experience of interviewing people is that people overwhelmingly want to tell their story and they want to be listened to. Most people find it to be quite a cathartic experience, and for many it might actually be the first time that they've sat down and actually spoken about what happened to them or their experience from beginning to end, and had someone who wants to hear the whole thing. Often people are talking about particular moments, whether it's an evacuation or if their house was lost, but actually to go and talk about that whole experience is, people often tell us that that was really valuable. And they also want to help people who might be faced with similar situations in the future. So while inevitably when you're speaking with people who have suffered loss, whether it's a loved one or a home or pets and animals, you know, when people lose their pets and animals, whether they're domestic animals or livestock, that can cause significant distress. So you're always going to be dealing with some degree of trauma and distress, but I think as researchers, it's your job not to exacerbate that, but you certainly have a responsibility to listen to it as well. And that's often what people want to talk about.
Thanks, Josh. And what we're going to do now is get some information from Anthony and Lorna on how some of the ways that we might be able to deal with some of this anxiety and trauma. And I might go first to Anthony, because one of the projects that Anthony's leading is looking at how we can support and communities to recover and build resilience, but the way in which we can do this using traditional knowledge and traditional expertise. So building on those thousands of years of the indigenous traditional owners and how they've dealt with a changing climate over millennia. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks, Sharon. I think it flows on well from what Josh has just shared. Everything has a story, you know, not just people. And often the focus is on people. Every insect, every bird, every plant, every animal, every fish, every whale, whatever, has a story. And we're interconnected with all those stories. And for me, you've got to go back to all those stories first. If you look at our creation, all those little things were created, and man and a woman and man were created last. Okay. But the focus at the moment is so much on the human. Generally, not everyone, but generally the focus is on the human. but we have these interwoven stories. Okay. Now a plant, an insect, a bird, your dog, your cat, you know, they never lie to you. They never mislead you. They never disrupt what you're doing in a way. You know, critical, they're there. You can trust them. So you just got to sit there and observe and learn their stories and how you're connected to those stories, how you relate to those stories, and how you can heal yourself is through healing and being a part of their story. You know, I've spoken to a number of people that have said what kept me sane after the fire was actually going out trying to look for koalas and to, you know, take care of the animals who lost all their food. That really helped their stress level and a distraction, I suppose they might have called it. But for me, that is healing self. With taking care of country, you're actually taking care of yourself. And taking care of self is taking care of country, if you look at it that way. So what our research is trying to do in a way is use a story around from country that's been here since basically the beginning of time to remove in a way that kind of selfishness of humans that can exist and that we're a part of a bigger thing, that we're a part of something that's much greater than us. And then we can share stories through that, through unlearning from those birds, insects, trees. I recently went for a grant with some other colleagues in a community, Aboriginal community organisation, and we weren't successful, and that's fine, that's the part of how things go. But our main statement was, we're going to learn from the birds themselves on how to help those birds come back and exist in that space that was damaged by fire. Okay, our knowledge comes from country. Our healing comes from country. So we need to observe and learn from those entities that don't lie, that don't mislead, that don't try and, you know, dominate in a way, which is happening on that political level that I think Sam was talking about at the moment, that competitive with governments and people and that competing for funds, or you got funds, I haven't got funds yet, that whole, when it focuses on the human. So for me, that's important. The story that we're going to use is about animals fighting. And our stories are still relevant as they were 80,000 years and upwards. The animals are still fighting today to get food, to get shelter, to be able to have a life with this devastation that came from, in a way, our human behavior is why we are in this situation. So we can heal nature to heal ourselves. So I think that I'll finish there. So thank you. Thank you for your ears.
Thanks, Anthony. And I think that's really true, because people can't be healthy unless we have a healthy planet. So we need to look after country, as you say. I'd like to go to Lorna now to talk about ongoing trauma as a mental health nurse, and with all her rich experience in this area, about how we cope with these ongoing disasters. So people who experienced fires and then floods, multiple extreme events and multiple disasters happening within a year, and then on top of that there's been COVID, and how communities, and the COVID crisis itself meant that people couldn't necessarily come together. And so I think that's also affected how people might heal from it. So perhaps we can hear from Lorna on that.
Thanks, Sharon. And Thanks, Anthony. Our First Nations people bring so much wisdom, and we need to sit and hear and listen. Trauma doesn't disappear overnight or within a week or two. It doesn't go away after the fires have been extinguished, after the floodwaters have abated. It doesn't go away after the rains have quenched the parched soil. It stays with us. Trauma stays with us for a long time, and each person deals with it differently. And Joshua talked about, you know, it's not the big traumas. I mean, obviously people have to deal with big traumas, but, you know, people are traumatized by what other people may judge as small events. But what's small for someone isn't small for someone else. So it's the recognition of the trauma, not the size of the event that may or may not have caused that trauma. And that's really important to understand. I think something that Anthony also talked about was providing a safe space. And I'm not necessarily convinced that all humans are good at this. We do judge, we compete. Your trauma's less than my trauma is more important because my fire was bigger or whatever it is. And we need not to do that. We need to sit back and listen. We need to sit back, provide a safe space to hear stories. And as Anthony said, don't judge. And that's really quite hard for humans not to do. Sometimes I think we're innately judgmental people, but being aware of that. So language is really, really important. And I don't think we pay enough attention to it. It's not at all helpful to remind people that the disaster has finished or that their trauma was 20 years ago. Or remind people saying things like, well, you know, you've lost your house, but you're still here. You know, it doesn't matter. It's about the trauma of the loss, not the fact that they've lost the house, they've lost but aren't you lucky because you're still here? Language like that is not helpful. So being really mindful of that. Something that comes to mind around the length of trauma is actually Queen Victoria in her grief for her husband. Once Prince Albert died, she grieved for the rest of her life. And a lot of people will say things like, well, you know, it's been 10 years now, or, you know, the fires were 2 years ago, or the cyclone or the flood. So it's a good reminder that people are entitled to grieve and entitled to live with their trauma for a long time. You use the word cope, Sharon, and I think sometimes that's what we need to think about is not parking the trauma or forgetting about it or thinking that it didn't happen, is the ongoing coping strategies. That's what we really need to focus on. And Joshua and Anthony and Sam have all talked about talking helps. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So COVID, I don't know about other people, but I'm over COVID. And a lot of people are. We see it all the time. And what COVID has done, I mean, there's been some positive things in it around people coming together. But what it's done, it's prevented people from gathering in many instances in face-to-face. Humans are innately herd animals, and our desire to gather with kin, with family, on country, with people we trust and love, has been severely impacted by COVID. What some people have done, though, many people and many communities have successfully done, they've found other ways of gathering. But we need to gather, whether we gather on Zoom, whether we gather now that restrictions are being lessened, we gather face-to-face, but we need to gather. And COVID has put the blip on that. What we do need to remember too is, yes, we've had COVID, and it in itself is a global pandemic, national, natural disaster. But it's taken the spotlight off our ongoing trauma and our ongoing disaster. So continuing to have those conversations, whether it's Zoom, whether it's phone, whether it's however you choose to do it, and understanding what your ways of coping are. And there are healthy ways of coping and ways of coping that may lead to things that aren't healthy. So drinking, taking drugs might not be a healthy way of coping. It may help people cope, but in the long run, it will exacerbate trauma or bring about perhaps more trauma. So understanding your coping, but going back to Joshua and Anthony and Sam, it's talking, it's gathering, it's respecting, it's trusting. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Lorna. And perhaps, Josh, you could, from your experience, give us some information about what you found from your research is the mental health support networks that are available and are actually helping people. And then there, I think there's a question about whether the disasters are changing people's perceptions of climate change, and also what we need to do about that. So that's two questions there.
Thanks, Sharon. Look, I'd agree with Lorna about how important talking is, and I guess what we're hearing, we've now interviewed, or we've actually conducted almost, I think we're about 195 interviews with people across New South Wales who were threatened or affected by bushfires last spring and summer. And in terms of their recovery, you know, we are hearing some things that were positive about COVID. People who lost their homes, for example, or who had substantial damage to their properties found that they were at home more, had more time for some of those jobs like clearing debris and building fences and things like that. And also a bit of time to reflect and to be with their family, which for a lot of people has been quite important. But on the flip side, as Lorna mentioned, the lockdowns prevented people from coming together. And while social media and Facebook and things like that can be useful platforms for having those sorts of interactions, nothing can really substitute face-to-face contact. So I think a lot of people, particularly in the sort of 3 or 4 months after, or the first 3 or 4 months of this year, that was a real issue for a lot of people. And the other thing that I've heard a number of times was that counselling and other mental health services needed to be provided online or by telephone. And a lot of people have told, quite a few people have told us that they held off accessing those services because they prefer to do it in person. And I think there's been a whole range of issues around demand for those services and because of COVID, the ability to provide them at a level that is required. So there's a lot of ongoing issues. Those are starting to ease up, but you know, just emphasise that from all of our research with bushfire affected communities, recovery, for want of a better term, is a very long process. It's, you know, we're often coming across people who don't recognise that they might need help and certainly don't go looking for it up to 18 months after a fire. So that really underscores the importance of providing those services longer term. Recovery is not something that's over and done with in a 2 or 3 month period. In terms of climate change, we've heard a lot of people talking about climate change. We've had, just as with society, the full spectrum of views. But, you know, we were reflecting the other day about the difference between the 2009 Black Saturday fires, where climate change barely rated a mention in our interviews. We don't ask people specifically about climate change because we use a very open-ended interviewing method or approach. But there's a lot of concern about climate change, its influence on the fire season that we've just had and what that means for the future. So there is a lot of concern, and that is, to us at least, quite new. We also saw a lot of that with the 2018 Reedy Swamp fire, of course, which was a very damaging fire that burnt and destroyed a lot of property and bush at a time in the year, mid-March, that we wouldn't normally expect a fire of that severity. So it's a big issue, and it's you know, people are talking about it.
Thanks, Josh. And so for our final information and ideas, I think I'll go to Sam to talk to us about how the community at Begas is 12 months on, and also how she feels that with the climate change issue is being addressed, and whether there's enough action, which is one of the questions that somebody's asked. So do we think there'll be positive reform and policy now that we've experienced these disasters, and that they're becoming more frequent? As Josh said, it's something that's, I think, becoming more and more apparent to people that this is an issue. So thanks, Sam.
No worries. You know, very hard to speak on behalf of your community because, as so many people have said, everyone's dealt with the fires differently and are dealing with recovery, for want of a better word, differently. And as Josh mentioned, you know, I myself have friends and family who have not sought support yet, and are beginning to feel now that they need to. The time after the fires was so busy that I do understand, and I did it myself, I was so busy fixing things and trying to help my friends and family fix things and just be safe, that the mental health capacity sort of came second. And if you leave, you know, it's like anything, you leave it for a while, you think, oh, it'll go away, it'll get better by itself. But with this, I found personally it hasn't, and talking about it does help. To, you know, talking about it a lot for me personally doesn't help. You know, it's good to let it out and talk about it every now and then, but I do like to also think about other things and not let it consume me. So, you know, everyone has had different reactions, and I was speaking just to one of our local psychologists the other day, and they have been so busy and so overwhelmed with first-time referrals. So even now, so we're 10 months on, people coming to see a psychologist for the very first time after the fires that really needed to and had a lot to talk about. So, you know, that everyone is dealing with things in a different way. In terms of, you know, climate change and action, because I work with young people in my role at the University of Bega campus, it's felt to me that climate change has very much been on the agenda for quite a long time, and it's our young people who are leading that in our regional areas, and also our farmers. I feel like, you know, there's this kind of misconception that farmers are climate deniers, but for me, I find that they're some of the people who are most in tune with the land and country because they work and live on it and every day, and they've been calling out for help and reform for a long time. So, you know, for our community, I guess we're just hopeful, well, most people, I can't speak for everyone, hopeful that there will be more action because there's been such a big evidence, such a big piece of evidence. It's very difficult to ignore. But, you know, once again, it does feel like COVID and other political issues take precedence for a reason. Sometimes, and other times for a not fathomable reason. So it's frustrating for the local community as well, in terms of that. But, you know, there was so many local Bega High School kids came out to have a demonstration just recently about climate change and about wanting to have their voices heard. And I work with Year 12 students who are going in to study politics with the specific goal in mind that they want to become a change maker and they want to change things. And that's really wonderful for me to be able to see and hear, and that's a privilege of my position as well here at the campus. And so that's really great. And I like to look towards those positive things, as well as working with our local community. And I was privileged to attend a Healing of Country event down here not long after the fires with Uncle Max and a number of local elders, which was so beautiful and positive and healing personally for me. And from, you know, I took my young boys at the time. We were given a totem, an animal that we've been now placed in our care to look after. And my kids have really taken that to heart, and we've been researching the cockatoo, which was our animal. I think that's because my kids were talking a lot. And how to bring that back to our property, and that's happened, and that's been just wonderful. And so that's been very healing as well. And working with our local Indigenous community and listening to them, who have so much knowledge, much more than we. So that's a big thing for us as well.
And just to reinforce that, Sam, that whole thing of silence is so important. So you can observe that cockatoo, you can observe nature, so you can learn from them. So they are so resilient, they are so tough and know how to come back, that we can learn so much from them through silence. And then we can communicate with each other. Talk about our totems, talk about the animals you're observing, because that will then give each other ideas of how to heal, how to be resilient, and how to be that a part of nature. You know, we can't, as Unc has always taught us to say, we got to give it away to keep it. So we need to give people responsibility for the land, okay, through a totem or a plant or an insect that you take care of. And that actually helps with your own healing. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, everyone. That's the formal part of the proceedings over. I think what we'll do now is I'll read out some of the questions that have been posed by the audience. So I've already alluded to one, which was around whether we're working fast enough on climate change. And I'd just like to support Sam in that the thing that gives me hope is the way that young people are actually taking this on board. And as Anthony says, you know, learning from the animals, but learning also from the young people and their passion for this, and they're showing us that we really need to do more about climate change and do it fast. So the next question is to Lorna and Anthony, and it says, in addition to talking, how else do you recommend expressing our thoughts and feelings about the fires? So artwork, gardening, choir, time in the ocean. Lorna, do you want to come in first on that one?
Absolutely, thanks, Sharon. First of all, I do want to acknowledge that I understand people do have clinical conditions, but I think it's important too about that ongoing coping, strategizing, is recognizing not to pathologize our anxiety and our grief and our anger. The climate crisis is happening to all of us, and we have a legitimate right to be concerned and to express concerns in ways that don't hurt others. So coping with things like music, art, doing, and Anthony's alluded to this, and so did Sam in looking after things. So mental health experts actually agree that really effective responses are collective. If we can accept the severity of the predicament, then we can invest or reinvest in meaningful effort. And this might mean coping one day at a time, short-term goals and getting through each day, but actually doing something, because doing something gives us some choice and it gives us some control. And that's what we lose. And that's what we need to refine. And Sam talked about that. It wasn't the fire, it wasn't the loss per se, it was the no control. So actually doing physical things or things like recycling more, land care, weed management, turning off our lights, conserving water, whatever it is that we invest in. But that's really important, because feeling involved and trying to be part of the solution. If we can do this as a group, all the better, because acting together makes us feel less powerless. Anthony, any extra thoughts?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I wasn't able to go down to that Brogo ceremony that Sam was talking about, but I helped Unc prepare it and organise it. And one of the big things that we really wanted to emphasise when we went to Brogo is that we got over about 500 plants to give to every single person. and every single one of those plants would help the native bees. So we selected we had a look at the native bee who does so much for every living thing, but us humans as well. So we invited people to plant plants on the property where we did it, and then gave people plants to take home, to plant, to take care of, to nurture, to help all these other living things that do so much for us. They do so much for us. So, and you can show respect in many ways, through art, through dance, through singing. But one of the best ways is respecting the entity that gives us so much. It gives us food, it gives us water, it gives us air. So how can we reciprocate? How can we simply reciprocate to something that gives us everything that we need? And in a way that, as I keep saying, that helps us heal. It helps us to take the focus off just us as humans. So, but by doing that, we're healing ourselves. So it's just sitting in silence and then talking to others and figuring out little ways that you can do. You know, if I have a shower, I put a bucket in there. Or, you know, there's a whole range of little things that everyone can do, from planting to protesting to doing research to teaching another person on how to take care of something. There's so much we can do other than, you know, than what's been happening for the last 100 years or so.
Thanks, Anthony. So there's another question for Joshua. And I think this is something that Anthony and Sam and Lorna have all touched on, but in your research, did you ask participants whether they felt they needed more agency in their recovery and a more grassroots approach to recovery? And I think that some of the things that we've been listening to here speak to that as well.
Yeah, we talk to people a lot about recovery and the sorts of supports, whether they're provided by government or their communities or their families, that they need and that they're getting. I'd say it really depends. Some people are in a position where they can get really involved in community activities and provide support to their neighbours and others. They may have a bit of a vision about how they might like things to be in the future. That might be to do with bushfire or climate or whatever it is. And we've seen some really great examples of community, like bushfire affected communities, who are banding together either to support each other and learn from their experiences, or to better prepare their communities in the future. And there's some great examples of that. But I'd also emphasise at the same time, there are people who might be isolated, vulnerable for other reasons. We've spoken to a lot of people in those positions who might not be that well connected to their community and who may not actually be very able to access support for themselves. So yeah, I think it depends. And I think that we need to do a bit better at identifying people who might need a little bit of help. And we see really good examples of that. We've spoken to old single farmers, for example, old men really, who don't work on computers. They don't deal with red tape and bureaucracy, as they put it. So when the paperwork that's required to be filled out to access financial support or other support comes, they toss it aside and think, well, I'm not doing that. And we've seen some pretty amazing people come in and help people in those sorts of positions. Simple things like just filling out a form, helping them get it to the right place. Things that might to us seem quite simple tasks, but for others are really enormous forms of help. So to go back to the question, I think you need both. You need that safety net where we're helping people who can't necessarily, for whatever reason, get involved in that grassroots community-led recovery or initiatives that are so fantastic. But also we should be supporting people who are in a position to engage in those sorts of activities, we should absolutely be supporting them to do it. And we've seen some, after every disaster, you see amazing examples of where usually pre-existing community groups or social networks identify a need that's not being met by government, and they'll fill that need. And you know, that's fantastic. And sometimes we see new groups emerge too, which, you know, the sort of famed example is Blaze Aid, which has provided so much help to people who have been affected by bushfire, drought and other hazards in Australia. Thanks,
Josh. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, so I think I'm going to have to wrap up soon. And I would like to thank all of the panelists for their contributions today. It's been really great starting to have this conversation, and I hope this is the first of many, in that with the new projects that Global Challenges has set up, we really want them to be research that happens between the university and the community, involves the community, and where we learn from all these experts in that lived experience, as much as we're being experts in our fields. And so hopefully it's a synergy. Hopefully it's something where we'll all work together on that. And that we'll be able to share this with you over the coming years, and also answers some of the other questions that have come up, because there's been quite a lot of interest and a lot of questions in the chat. And so I've been really struck with, we might try to answer some of those questions on social media, because there are other questions that we haven't been able to deal with. And there's a question in there about some of the survivors of violence and trauma have great knowledge and skills in living in difficult ruined spaces, in living generous, caring lives against the odds. And they're vital qualities for our climate crisis times, where peaceful joint futures for other than humans and humans seem barely possible, but are absolutely necessary. So how do we get to this knowledge and stories heard, recognised and respected? And I think Anthony and Sam and Josh and Lorna have all helped us to start that journey, which I think is something we will hope to go on with. We've been talking about trauma, we've been talking about anxiety, and I know that this might trigger concerns and anxiety in people. So I just like to make sure that everyone's aware that the Lifeline number is 131114 if anyone is experiencing anxiety and wants to talk to someone. But thank you all for joining us in this conversation. Thank you to our panelists. And I'd also like to thank Emma and Tash and Sam for hosting us, and Emma and Tash for actually making this happen. And they're actually visiting the campuses down the coast and checking in with our various projects. So thank you, Emma, and thank you, Tash, for your help on this as well. So I think, and Liz, oh yes, and I forgot Liz, sorry, Emma's just added that in this. Liz also in our office here at the university. So please keep an eye on social media. We'll try to answer the other questions. You can always email us at Global Challenges and ask the questions. Lorna's one of our leaders. Sam and Josh and Anthony are all involved in our projects, and we do welcome community engagement. So if you have any bright ideas, send them in. If you have questions, please feel free to send those in, and we'll try to answer them through other channels and in our next in conversation, which will hopefully showcase more of our projects and the research that they've been doing, and we'll be able to inform people about recent findings. So thank you to all the panelists, and thank you all for listening.